Picture this. It's February 1991. The Cold War is ending, and American intelligence analysts think they've seen everything the Soviet Navy can do. They've tracked ballistic missile submarines for decades, monitored underwater launches, and maintained constant vigilance over Soviet nuclear capabilities. But then, in the icy waters of the Barents Sea, something happens that defies every calculation. A single Soviet submarine surfaces briefly, and within minutes, 16 nuclear-tipped missiles roar out of the water in rapid succession. American observers watch in stunned silence as the submarine executes what seems impossible, a full salvo launch that could theoretically devastate 16 cities in less time than it takes to scramble a defense. For many in the Pentagon, this demonstration of the Typhoon-class submarine wasn't just impressive. It felt like a glimpse into Armageddon. The Americans were used to Soviet submarine launches, but this was different. Previous tests had shown submarines firing missiles one at a time, with pauses between launches. But the Typhoon wasn't following that script. Instead, it unleashed a devastating barrage of RSM, 52 missiles, all in quick succession. Each missile carried enough nuclear firepower to obliterate a major metropolitan area. Designed not for surgical strikes, but for overwhelming first-strike capability, the full salvo could theoretically deliver megatons of destruction before any defense system could respond. And the worst part? The Typhoon could do this from beneath the Arctic ice, hidden from satellites and surface vessels, making detection nearly impossible until the missiles were already airborne. Imagine being a NATO naval commander monitoring Soviet activities and suddenly watching 16 contrails pierce the sky from a single point in the ocean. By 1991, the United States and Soviet Union were moving toward détente, yet here was proof that the Soviets had perfected the most terrifying naval weapon ever conceived. The submarine itself was already legendary, at 175 meters long and displacing 48,000 tons when submerged. It was the largest submarine ever built. But when Western analysts saw what it could do with all 20 of its missile tubes, 16 fired in this particular demonstration, they understood the strategic nightmare it represented. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement, proof that Soviet engineering could create a platform capable of ending civilization as we know it in under an hour. The name Typhoon itself was a NATO designation. The Soviets called it Project 941, Akula shark. Western intelligence officers who first identified the class in satellite photos thought the sheer size was an error in measurement. The submarine looked like two vessels fused together, with a distinctive turtleback hull that concealed its forest of missile tubes. What followed was decades of concern. This underwater giant didn't need to come close to enemy shores. It could hide beneath the polar ice cap, break through when ordered, and launch its apocalyptic payload before anyone could stop it. In those final years of the Cold War, both superpowers continued developing weapons that seemed designed for mutual destruction. But the Typhoon stood out because it turned a submarine into a mobile nuclear arsenal, something American planners had nightmares about. It blurred the line between deterrent and doomsday weapon, giving Soviet commanders a tool that could both threaten annihilation and survive retaliation. To American strategists, already weary from decades of nuclear brinkmanship, the arrival of this capability felt like yet another escalation in an arms race that never seemed to end. This was only the beginning. The Typhoon would go on to serve as the ultimate symbol of Soviet submarine might, leaving behind a legacy of fear and respect that endures even after the Cold War's conclusion. It was a weapon of spectacle and terror, and its full salvo demonstrations burned themselves into the memories of everyone who witnessed them. The birth of a giant. The story of the Typhoon-class submarine didn't begin in the water. It started in Soviet naval planning offices in the 1970s, where admirals and engineers were looking for ways to ensure the USSR could strike back even after absorbing a nuclear first strike. By the mid-1970s, Soviet planners had studied American Trident submarines and saw their capability to launch ballistic missiles from deep underwater. The Kremlin began asking, could the Soviet Union build something even more formidable, a submarine so large and so heavily armed that it could guarantee devastating retaliation? The answer came from the Rubin Design Bureau, which created Project 941. Chief designer Sergei Kovalev oversaw the development of what would become the largest submarine ever constructed. The design was revolutionary. Rather than a single-pressure hull like conventional submarines, the Typhoon featured two parallel hulls connected by a central compartment, giving it immense internal volume. This unique configuration allowed it to carry 20 R-39 RIF, NATO designation, SS, and 20 Sturgeon ballistic missiles, each capable of carrying up to 10 multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles (MIRVs). The missiles themselves were specifically designed for the Typhoon. Each R-39 stood 16 meters tall and weighed 84 tons. Unlike earlier Soviet submarine launch ballistic missiles, SLBMs, these were solid-fuel rockets, meaning they could be launched much more quickly than liquid-fuel predecessors. The rockets weren't particularly accurate by modern standards, but when each missile could scatter 10 nuclear warheads across a wide area, precision became less critical. When all 20 launched together, they represented 200 potential nuclear strikes, enough to overwhelm any missile defense system of the era. The submarine looked enormous, even in construction photographs. Soldiers and engineers standing beside the hull during building appeared tiny against its massive frame. The Typhoon measured 175 meters in length, with a beam of 23 meters, roughly the size of two American Ohio-class submarines placed side by side. Its displacement when submerged reached 48,000 tons, making it more massive than many World War II battleships. Engineers tested prototypes of the launch system throughout the early 1980s, refining the cold launch technology that allowed missiles to be ejected from their tubes using compressed gas before their rocket motors ignited. This technique reduced stress on the submarine and allowed for rapid sequential launches. The system was designed to fire all 20 missiles in less than 10 minutes, a capability that terrified Western naval planners. Technically, the Typhoon represented the pinnacle of Soviet submarine engineering. Its double-hull design provided exceptional survivability, with armored compartments that could withstand depth charge attacks. The submarine could operate under Arctic ice for months, using the ice cap as protective cover while remaining ready to surface and launch at a moment's notice. Its two OK-650 nuclear reactors provided virtually unlimited range, and it could maintain speeds of 25 knots submerged. The design also reflected Soviet naval doctrine. Unlike American submarines, which emphasized stealth and individual missile accuracy, the Typhoon was built for raw firepower and survivability. Its mission was straightforward: survive long enough to launch its entire missile complement in retaliation for a NATO first strike. The sheer number of warheads it could deliver made it the ultimate deterrent. No enemy could risk attacking if it meant facing 200 nuclear explosions in response. When the first Typhoon submarine, TK-208, was commissioned in 1981, NATO intelligence went into overdrive. Satellite photos revealed the massive vessel at Syeverodvinsk shipyard, and Western analysts scrambled to understand its capabilities. The Americans had no equivalent. Their largest missile submarines carried 24 missiles, but they were significantly smaller vessels. The Typhoon represented something new and terrifying, a submarine specifically designed to survive nuclear war and ensure mutual destruction. By the time multiple Typhoons entered service in the mid-1980s, they had become symbols of Soviet military might. The design may have been born from Cold War paranoia, but its execution proved unforgettable. When the world finally saw what these submarines could do, firing full salvos that lit up the Arctic sky, the demonstration left no doubt about Soviet capabilities. First blood, testing the nightmare. The Typhoon-class submarine's first full demonstration came not in combat, but during carefully monitored test launches that shocked Western observers. Throughout the 1980s, American intelligence agencies tracked Soviet missile tests from submarines, but nothing prepared them for the sight of a Typhoon executing a near-simultaneous launch of multiple missiles. The first confirmed multi-missile launch occurred in 1985 when TK-208 fired a salvo of missiles in the White Sea Test Range. When intelligence satellites captured the event, analysts in Washington studied the footage with growing alarm. The result stunned everyone present, including the American submarine officers who were tracking Soviet activities. Instead of the methodical, spaced launches typical of earlier Soviet submarines, the Typhoon unleashed missiles in rapid succession. One after another, the 39 missiles burst from the water in towering columns of flame and steam. Within minutes, multiple contrails streaked across the northern sky. For NATO naval planners, who had spent years gaming out nuclear scenarios, this was their worst nightmare made real. Reports from naval intelligence described the launch as unlike anything observed in previous Soviet tests. Experienced analysts who had monitored dozens of submarine launches were shocked by the speed and coordination. The Typhoon's cold launch system ejected missiles from their tubes using compressed gas, and the rockets ignited only after clearing the water. This meant the submarine experienced minimal stress during launch and could fire again almost immediately. To American observers, this seemed like a technological leap, a weapon that could unleash apocalyptic firepower before defenses could react. One dramatic example comes from a 1989 test, where a Typhoon fired 16 missiles in quick succession during a winter exercise. NATO intelligence ships stationed in international waters detected the launch sequence, and within hours, satellite imagery confirmed what had happened. A single submarine had delivered the equivalent of 160 nuclear warheads toward test targets thousands of kilometers away. Military analysts later calculated that if those missiles had been aimed at American cities, they could have devastated the entire eastern seaboard before the National Command Authority could even confirm an attack was underway. Another demonstration came during the twilight years of the Soviet Union. In February 1991, as the USSR was beginning to fracture, the Soviet Navy conducted what would be one of its final major demonstrations of military power. A Typhoon-class submarine surfaced through Arctic ice and launched 16 missiles in approximately 10 minutes. Western submarines monitoring the exercise reported the launch to NORAD, and for several tense minutes, American defense systems went on alert until it was confirmed as a test. The incident revealed how close the world still lived to nuclear catastrophe, even as the Cold War was ending. For the U.S. Navy, these early demonstrations validated fears that had been building since the Typhoon's first appearance. Commanders realized that traditional anti-submarine warfare tactics might be insufficient against a vessel that could remain hidden under ice and still launch a devastating attack. The psychological impact was immense even among hardened naval officers who understood nuclear deterrence. The sight of 16 missiles rising from a single point in the ocean was profoundly unsettling. Accounts from Soviet submariners who served on Typhoons described the launches with professional pride mixed with awareness of what they were practicing. One commander later recalled in interviews that the crew understood they were manning a weapon that could end the world. The launches were technical marvels, coordinating the firing sequence, managing the submarine stability as thousands of tons of missiles left the vessel, and maintaining stealth afterward required exceptional training and discipline. The Typhoon's first appearances may have been in controlled tests, but they proved the weapon's potential in the most convincing way possible, by demonstrating that Soviet submarines could deliver nuclear annihilation faster than any defense could respond. For American strategists, it marked the beginning of a terrifying new chapter in undersea nuclear warfare. The strategic impact. Once the Typhoon-class submarines became operational in larger numbers, their strategic significance spread quickly through Pentagon briefings and NATO planning sessions. These submarines represented a paradigm shift in nuclear deterrence. Traditional strategic thinking assumed that submarine-launched missiles would be used for second-strike retaliation, surviving an enemy's first attack and responding in kind. But the Typhoon's massive payload and rapid launch capability made it theoretically suitable for a first strike, a possibility that fundamentally altered Cold War calculations. Think about the kind of naval warfare both superpowers were expecting in the 1980s. They had prepared for submarine hunts, for tracking missile boats through the Atlantic, and for the cat-and-mouse games of underwater detection. But they had not expected a submarine that could hide beneath polar ice, break through when ordered, and launch enough nuclear weapons to destroy an entire nation before anyone could respond. To American strategists, this was a nightmare scenario they couldn't adequately plan for. Each Typhoon carried 20 R-39 missiles, and each missile could deliver up to 10 independently targetable warheads. That meant a single submarine possessed the theoretical capability to strike 200 separate targets. When Soviet planners deployed 6 Typhoon submarines, By the late 1980s, the combined arsenal represented 1,200 potential nuclear strikes. Witnesses to Pentagon War games described scenarios where even a successful first strike against Soviet land-based missiles would still leave multiple typhoons at sea, ready to annihilate NATO countries in retaliation. The strategic effect wasn't just numerical, it was also psychological. Imagine the burden on American commanders knowing that somewhere under the Arctic ice, submarines were lurking with enough firepower to end civilization. Unlike land-based missiles that could be targeted or bombers that could be intercepted, submarines were nearly impossible to track reliably. The Typhoon's ability to operate under ice for months made detection even harder. Soviet doctrine called for these submarines to patrol in bastions, protected areas under the ice cap, where NATO attack submarines couldn't easily reach them. Accounts from places like the Pentagon and NATO headquarters detail how typhoons changed strategic planning. American nuclear targeting shifted to account for the possibility that typhoons might launch first. New anti-submarine warfare programs received massive funding, with Los Angeles-class attack submarines specifically tasked with hunting Soviet missile boats. The U.S. also accelerated development of its own Ohio-class submarines, though even these impressive vessels couldn't match the Typhoon's raw missile capacity. The destructive potential wasn't just physical, it was also doctrinal. For decades, nuclear strategy had been based on the concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD, where neither side would start a war because both would be annihilated. But weapons like the Typhoon raised uncomfortable questions. If the Soviets believed they could launch a devastating first strike from submarines before America could respond, did MAD still hold? Defense intellectuals spent countless hours gaming out scenarios, and most concluded that the Typhoon actually strengthened deterrence by making nuclear war seem even more catastrophic and unwinnable. The Typhoon also had a tactical advantage in survivability. While American Trident submarines relied on stealth and depth, the Typhoon's double-hull design and Arctic operating environment made it extraordinarily difficult to kill. Even if NATO submarines detected a Typhoon, attacking it under ice was nearly impossible. For American naval commanders, this meant accepting that in any nuclear exchange, several Typhoons would almost certainly survive to launch their missiles, guaranteeing apocalyptic retaliation regardless of how successful a first strike might be. In many ways, the Typhoon embodied the brutal logic of Cold War nuclear strategy. Build weapons so terrible that using them would be suicidal, thereby ensuring they would never be used. Its purpose was simple: survive, remain hidden, and maintain the capability to destroy the enemy even after your own nation had been devastated. For the Soviets, it was the ultimate insurance policy. For Americans, it was a constant reminder that the nuclear balance of terror rested on submarines they could barely track, carrying weapons they couldn't defend against. By the late 1980s, the Typhoon had become more than just a submarine. It was a symbol of the Cold War's existential dread, a physical manifestation of the doctrine that peace could only be maintained through the threat of total annihilation. For both superpowers, stretched thin by decades of arms racing, the Typhoon represented both the pinnacle of naval engineering and the depths of Cold War paranoia. Soviet pride, American fear. For Soviet submariners and naval planners, the Typhoon wasn't just a weapon. It was a source of immense national pride. The submarine represented the pinnacle of Soviet engineering, proof that the USSR could match or exceed American technology in the most critical area of Cold War competition. Crews who served aboard Typhoons described the experience with reverence. Unlike earlier Soviet submarines, which were cramped and uncomfortable, the Typhoon offered relatively spacious accommodations. With its massive internal volume, the submarine included amenities unusual for military vessels: a gymnasium, sauna, and even a small swimming pool. For crews spending months under Arctic ice, these comforts were essential for maintaining morale. Soviet propaganda celebrated the Typhoon extensively. State media showcased the submarines as symbols of Soviet military superiority, often featuring footage of launches during national celebrations. The message was clear: the USSR possessed weapons that could guarantee the survival of socialism even in nuclear war. For Soviet citizens raised on Cold War rhetoric, the Typhoon represented security. the knowledge that their nation could not be destroyed without ensuring mutual annihilation. But for Americans, the Typhoon represented something entirely different, a weapon they couldn't adequately counter. U.S. Navy anti-submarine warfare experts spent the 1980s developing tactics to track and potentially destroy typhoons, but the submarine's Arctic operations made this extraordinarily difficult. Attack submarines like the Los Angeles class were sent on dangerous missions under the ice cap, trying to locate Soviet missile boats before they could launch. These cat-and-mouse games played out in complete secrecy, with American submariners knowing that a single mistake could trigger World War III. Eyewitness accounts from American submarine commanders revealed deep respect mixed with fear. One captain who tracked a typhoon in the Barents Sea during the 1980s later described the experience. "We knew what that boat could do. 20 missiles, 200 warheads. Even if we torpedoed it, there was no guarantee we'd stop it from launching. That knowledge sat with us every moment of the patrol." The fear extended to civilian leadership as well. Presidential briefings during the Reagan administration included regular updates on Typhoon deployments. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger reportedly described the Typhoon as the most destabilizing weapon system in the Soviet arsenal during classified congressional testimony. The concern wasn't just the submarine's firepower, it was their invulnerability. Unlike land-based missiles that could theoretically be destroyed in a first strike, Typhoons at sea were essentially unstoppable once they received launch orders. There's also evidence that American defense analysts struggled with worst-case scenarios. War games conducted at the Naval War College repeatedly showed that even if the U.S. successfully destroyed most Soviet strategic forces, surviving typhoons would still deliver catastrophic retaliation. Some simulations suggested that just 2 typhoons surviving a NATO first strike could kill 50 million Americans in the subsequent counterattack. These scenarios weren't meant to plan for nuclear war. They were meant to ensure political leaders understood that such a war could never be won. By the mid-1980s, the psychological weight of the typhoon had become part of Cold War consciousness. American children grew up with nuclear attack drills in schools, and adults lived with the knowledge that Soviet submarines were lurking in the Arctic, ready to launch at any moment. The Typhoon became a recurring villain in Cold War fiction. Tom Clancy's The Hunt for Red October featured a modified Typhoon as its central plot device, cementing the submarine's place in popular imagination. Soviet submariners, for their part, understood the weight of their responsibility. Interviews with Typhoon crews conducted after the Cold War reveal that many struggled with the knowledge of what they were prepared to do. One missile officer recalled, "We trained every day to end the world. We hoped we would never receive those orders, but we were ready to obey them without question. That's a heavy burden to carry." The Typhoon also became part of the mythology of Soviet military might. Even as the USSR began to crumble in the late 1980s, the submarines remained symbols of power. When Western analysts learned that economic problems were forcing the Soviet Navy to reduce operations, they noted with relief that Typhoon patrols were being cut back. The submarines hadn't become less dangerous. There simply wasn't enough money to keep them at sea. For both superpowers, the Typhoon represented the ultimate expression of nuclear deterrence, a weapon so powerful that its very existence helped prevent the war it was designed to fight. For Americans, it was one more terrifying sign that the Soviets had no shortage of ways to ensure mutual destruction. For Soviets, it was proof that their nation would never be defeated without taking its enemies down with it. Limitations and realities. As formidable as the Typhoon was, it wasn't without significant limitations. In fact, Soviet naval officers had a complex relationship with these submarines. Mounted with 20 massive missile tubes and displacing 48,000 tons, the Typhoon was expensive to operate and maintain. Each submarine required a crew of 160 highly trained officers and sailors, and keeping the vessel at sea for extended patrols consumed enormous resources. Some Soviet naval planners privately complained that the Typhoons were engineering marvels that drained budgets needed for other naval programs. Operating the Typhoon presented unique challenges. The submarine's massive size made it easier to detect than smaller vessels, despite its advanced quieting technology. American attack submarines became increasingly skilled at tracking Typhoons through acoustic signatures. While the Typhoon could hide under Arctic ice, transiting to and from patrol areas often exposed it to NATO surveillance. Once detected, a Typhoon became a priority target for American attack submarines, shadowing its movements. Loading and maintaining the R-39 missiles was another challenge. Each missile required careful handling, and the solid-fuel rockets had limited shelf lives before requiring refurbishment. Soviet maintenance crews had to perform complex operations to keep the missiles ready, and technical problems occasionally forced submarines to return to port. Some Western analysts later learned that not all Typhoons were fully loaded with missiles during patrols due to maintenance issues, a reality that didn't match the fearsome reputation these boats had earned. Accuracy was also a persistent concern. While the R-39 missiles had impressive range, 8,300 kilometers, their circular error probable CEP was approximately 500 meters. This made them excellent for targeting large areas like cities, but nearly useless for precision strikes against hardened military installations. If commanders wanted to destroy specific targets like command bunkers or missile silos, land-based ICBMs were far more reliable. The Typhoon's mission was fundamentally about deterrence through city destruction capability rather than military precision targeting. The launch system itself, while innovative, had vulnerabilities. The cold launch technique was reliable, but it required the submarine to be at or near the surface. This meant that during the critical moments of launching missiles, the Typhoon was most vulnerable to attack. American nuclear attack submarines were specifically trained to destroy Soviet missile boats during launch sequences, and war games suggested that even a few minutes' warning could allow an intercepting submarine to fire torpedoes before the Typhoon completed its salvo. For these reasons, the Typhoon never became as numerous as some Western analysts initially feared. Only 6 were built between 1981 and 1989: TK-208, TK-202, TK-12, TK-13, TK-17, and TK-20. This was far fewer than the 20-plus submarines some Pentagon estimates had projected in the early 1980s. Soviet naval leadership understood the submarine strengths, but also recognized their limitations. They were best used as strategic deterrents, lurking under ice and maintaining the threat of retaliation, rather than as tactical weapons for conventional naval warfare. Cost was an ever-present concern. Each Typhoon cost approximately 1.5 billion rubles, an enormous sum for the Soviet economy. As the USSR's financial situation deteriorated in the late 1980s, maintaining these submarines became increasingly difficult. By 1990, some Typhoons were spending more time in port than at sea, not because of technical problems, but because the Soviet Navy couldn't afford the operational costs. It's worth noting that many Soviet submariners were proud of the Typhoons, but acknowledged their limitations. Some officers later admitted that the submarines were propaganda tools as much as weapons, designed to impress and intimidate as much as to fight. The psychological impact of a Typhoon far exceeded its practical military utility in many scenarios. Tankers had enough to worry about tracking American attack submarines without hauling around the world's largest submarine that announced its presence through sheer size. Ultimately, the Typhoon was a specialized weapon, brutally effective in its intended role of nuclear deterrence, but too expensive and cumbersome to be a flexible naval asset. Its legacy rests not on perfection, but on its psychological impact, a weapon that terrified NATO planners, projected Soviet power, and left an unforgettable mark on Cold War history. Its flaws were real, but in the context of nuclear deterrence, even an imperfect weapon that could end civilization was more than sufficient. Comparing Titans, Typhoon versus Western counterparts. When historians look at the Typhoon-class submarine today, they often place it alongside other famous ballistic missile submarines of the Cold War era. The comparisons reveal different philosophies of naval nuclear warfare. The most obvious parallel is the American Ohio-class submarine, first commissioned in 1981, the same year as the first Typhoon. The Ohio carried 24 Trident I missiles, later upgraded to Trident II, each with multiple warheads. While the Ohio carried more missiles than most Soviet designs, the Typhoon still held the edge in total throw weight and number of warheads. The key difference was philosophy. American submarines emphasized stealth, accuracy, and survivability through silence. Ohio-class boats were designed to operate quietly in deep ocean basins, making detection nearly impossible. They relied on extremely accurate Trident missiles that could destroy hardened targets, like missile silos. By contrast, the Typhoon emphasized raw firepower and survivability through protection and environment. It operated under Arctic ice, where NATO submarines struggled to follow, and its massive size included armored compartments that could withstand torpedo attacks better than slimmer Western designs. The British also operated ballistic missile submarines during this period. The Resolution class, and later the Vanguard class, carried 16 missiles each, sophisticated weapons, but on much smaller platforms. The French Le Triomphant-class submarines followed similar patterns. All Western designs shared a common trait. They were smaller, quieter, and relied on stealth as their primary defense. The Typhoon, by contrast, was designed on the assumption that it would be detected eventually, so it needed to survive long enough to launch its missiles despite being under attack. Soviet naval doctrine differed fundamentally from NATO approaches. While American submarines were intended to patrol far from home waters, hunting enemy submarines and maintaining strategic deterrence through stealth, Soviet ballistic missile submarines were designed to remain in protected bastions, areas of ocean dominated by Soviet naval and air power. The Typhoon's Arctic operations fit this perfectly. Under the ice cap, NATO attack submarines faced enormous challenges tracking and engaging Soviet boats, giving Typhoons a defensive advantage no Western submarine enjoyed. In combat effect, the Typhoon could deliver more nuclear warheads than any Western submarine. An Ohio-class boat with 24 Trident II missiles, carrying 8 warheads, each could theoretically strike 192 targets, slightly fewer than a Typhoon's 200 warheads, but with far greater accuracy. However, Soviet planners cared less about precision than about overwhelming enemy defenses. The Typhoon's massive salvo was designed to saturate American anti-ballistic missile systems, ensuring that even if many warheads were intercepted, enough would get through to devastate major cities. The legacy of the Typhoon also lies in its psychological impact compared to Western boats. American and British submarines operated in secrecy. Most citizens had only vague awareness of their existence, but the Typhoon was publicized by Soviet media, shown in parades and documentaries. It became a symbol of Soviet power in ways that Western submarines never did. NATO planners worried about Typhoons precisely because they represented something different from Western submarine doctrine, a brute force approach to deterrence that seemed to care less about survivability than about ensuring apocalyptic retaliation. For American submariners who tracked Typhoons, the comparison was always uncomfortable. One former captain of a Los Angeles-class attack submarine later reflected, "Our Ohio boats were better in every technical measure, quieter, more accurate, more reliable. But there was something terrifying about the Typhoon's simplicity. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to launch its missiles, and the sheer number of warheads would do the rest." Post-war analyses have noted that both approaches, American stealth and Soviet armor, were responses to the same problem: how to ensure a credible nuclear deterrent. The Typhoon represented the Soviet answer: build submarines so large and so heavily armed that even a partially successful launch would guarantee unacceptable destruction. The Americans answered with submarines so quiet they couldn't be found. Both approaches worked in maintaining deterrence, and both terrified the opposing side. The Typhoon earned its place in that fearsome family of weapons, proof that the Soviets could match American submarine technology while taking a completely different engineering path. Though fewer in number than Western missile submarines, the Typhoon's combination of firepower, protective design, and Arctic operations made it one of the most feared weapons of the Cold War. Final salvos, the end of an era. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed, the Typhoon-class submarines were sailing toward obsolescence, despite their fearsome capabilities. The end of the Cold War transformed these submarines from strategic necessities into expensive burdens. In 1991, as the USSR dissolved, the newly formed Russian Federation inherited 6 Typhoons, but lacked the resources to maintain them properly. The submarines that had once symbolized Soviet naval supremacy now sat in port more often than they patrolled, victims of economic collapse. The final major demonstration of Typhoon capability came in February 1991, the 16-missile launch that stunned American observers. This exercise, conducted as the Soviet Union was fracturing, seemed almost like a farewell, one last proof that Soviet engineering had created something remarkable before the empire fell apart. After that, Typhoon operations declined sharply. By 1996, only one submarine, TK-208, renamed Dmitry Donskoy, remained fully operational. The others were gradually decommissioned, their nuclear reactors defueled, and their missile tubes emptied. The Typhoons faced a problem unique to post-Cold War disarmament. They were too expensive to operate and too complex to quickly decommission. Each submarine contained 2 nuclear reactors requiring careful dismantlement, and the process of safely removing radioactive materials took years. International programs, including American funding through the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, helped finance the safe disposal of these submarines. 3 Typhoons, TK-202, TK-12, and TK-13, were dismantled in the early 2000s at shipyards in Severodvinsk. Interestingly, one Typhoon survived longer than expected. Dmitry Donskoy was converted into a test platform for the new Bulava submarine-launched ballistic missile system. The submarine's massive size made it ideal for testing purposes, and it remained in service until 2023, more than 4 decades after its commissioning. Russian submariners who served on Donskoy during its later years described it with a mixture of nostalgia and practicality. "She was built to end the world," one officer recalled, "but she ended up helping us build the next generation of submarines instead." For American naval intelligence, the decommissioning of Typhoons was tracked with relief. Each submarine removed from service meant one less apocalyptic threat lurking under Arctic ice. However, analysts noted that Russia's newer Boreai-class submarines, while smaller, carried similarly capable missiles and maintained the strategic deterrent the Typhoons had once provided. The Cold War might have ended, but submarine-based nuclear deterrence continued. The Typhoon's final chapter included an unexpected cultural afterlife. The submarine gained renewed fame through the 1990 film, The Hunt for Red October, which featured a fictionalized Typhoon-class boat with a revolutionary silent propulsion system. While the movie took significant liberties with technology, it introduced global audiences to the submarine's distinctive appearance and massive size. For many people around the world, the Typhoon became synonymous with Cold War submarine warfare, cementing its place in popular culture alongside its historical legacy. By 2023, with Dmitry Donskoy finally retired, the Typhoon era officially ended. The submarines had served their purpose. They had maintained nuclear deterrence, survived the Cold War without ever firing their missiles in anger, and reminded the world of the terrifying capabilities both superpowers possessed. For submariners on both sides, the Typhoons represented the ultimate expression of Cold War logic, weapons built not to be used, but to be feared. Veterans of both navies reflected on the Typhoon years with complex emotions. Soviet submariners took pride in having operated the largest submarines ever built, while acknowledging relief that their weapons never had to be used. American submariners who hunted Typhoons spoke of professional respect for their adversaries and profound gratitude that the Cold War ended without nuclear war. One American captain summarized it simply: "We spent years preparing to kill each other. I'm glad we never had to find out who would have one." The last Typhoons now rest in shipbreaking yards or serve as museum pieces, their massive hulls a reminder of an era when the fate of human civilization rested in the hands of submarine crews. The Germans, rather. The world never forgot those demonstrations of power. The sight of 16 missiles rising from beneath the waves became a lasting symbol not just of Soviet engineering, but of the precarious balance that prevented nuclear war. And for history, the Typhoon remains a reminder of how, in the final decades of the Cold War, even the most powerful weapons ultimately served peace by being too terrible to ever use. It wasn't perfect, and its mission was apocalyptic, but the Typhoon served its purpose: to terrify, to deter, and to remind everyone that some wars must never be fought.